So we're going to continue with our discussion of moral reasoning. And we left off at the idea of fairness. We want to today discuss the meaning of fairness, its elements, as criteria of justification of our principles of justice. And I will argue that there are at least four criteria of fairness: equality, recognition, reciprocity, and impartiality. They shape the meaning of what fairness is. They define what fairness is. There might be more criteria or elements, but these seem to be prominent elements. So the first criterion is equality. The presupposition that every human being should be considered as having an equal and inherent dignity. We might be unequal in a variety of ways, but from a moral point of view, we can and perhaps should, I would argue, we should recognize each other as moral equals, in the sense that one's life is not of greater value than anyone else's life. That we have a basic equality among us. And that's a presupposition, an assumption of fairness. And fairness requires that we recognize that persons have equal standing, and that in the society, that there's not a fundamental hierarchy of value among people in society. Of course, history suggests that there's a long history of inequality in this sense, of treating certain people, certain groups of people, as inherently unequal. Women, for example, various ethnic minority groups, as inherently unequal. But moral reasoning and fairness would require us to assume and to affirm that we are equal in a very basic sense, that no one's life is more valuable than anyone else's life, and that therefore we should, everyone's interests, everyone's good should be equally considered when we make decisions about what our principles should be. Immanuel Kant famously gave articulation to this idea in his second formulation of the categorical imperative, which is the categorical imperative is an idea of a basic moral principle, a basic moral principle of fairness, actually. And he wrote, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So Kant is suggesting or asserting that the fundamental principle of morality, of ethics, is to treat humanity as an end, that is, as equally valuable, and to treat a person only as a means and not as an end is a fundamental is fundamentally immoral. And that defines various, to treat others as only means is exemplified in various kinds of exploitation, various forms of oppression, of violence, and not to respect their dignity. And so this equality is the idea of humanity as an end in itself, and that gives rise to respect, a basic principle of respect for persons. That each person as a human being is entitled to respect, to be respected in a fundamental sense. And that respect follows from their standing as an equal. And this equality and respect structures a duty to offer each other justification for our basic moral principles, and that are consistent with their standing as equals. So equality can be considered as a basic premise of valid moral reasoning. So to enter into moral reasoning, with moral deliberation with someone or others requires that we recognize their equality, that we're equal, as opposed to being superior to. Does that make sense? So we're going to assert as a criterion of fairness, equality, basic moral equality. And as we'll see, that leads to legal equality, equal standing before the law, leads to political equality, a right to equal representation, equal participation in the political system, and possibly other rights. Any questions? Okay. So the second criterion is what we can refer to as recognition. The idea of recognition, and this goes back to the ancient Greeks, and they had their word thymos gave expression to a psychological demand that human beings have, a basic desire to be recognized and to be respected. And the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, the Athenians referred to that as thymos. Every human being has a desire to be recognized as an equal. And that gives expression to isothymia, a basic desire to be recognized. Hegel, George Hegel, in the 19th century, revived this idea of the desire to be recognized as an equal, and in terms of his idea of recognition, that moral relationship, an ethical life for Hegel was premised on this idea of being recognized. That we can only have moral relations, ethical relations between us, if we recognize each other as equals and recognize our duty of respect for each other. And that's what he called recognition. And it goes hand in hand with equality. And the recognition should be reciprocal. It should be mutual, a mutual recognition. So a requirement of fairness is to recognize in the other other person is a self-determining end in themselves. That each person has the capacity and the right to be self-determining as an end. That is, they are their claims are self-originating by virtue of each one of us having equality and equal standing. We have what goes along with that is the right to make claims about our interests, to have interests that should be recognized and respected by others. Hegel translated this idea of recognition into a principle that's consistent with Kant's categorical imperative. Be a person and respect others as persons. And that being a person, being a moral agent, and a person with a self-determining person requires that we are recognized by others as self-determined. Because we are, the assumption is we are social beings. We live in relationship with others. And that's true, right? We live our whole lives in relationship to others. And because of that, our being, our personhood is contingent upon being recognized as others, by others. We could be recognized as Hegel describes a master-slave relationship as the opposite of recognition, where the slave, both the master and the slave, crave, based upon thymos, they want to be recognized. But in that particular social relationship where one person is superior to the other and has all the power and sees the other as less than inferior, neither side can be recognized in that dynamic. Because even if the slave recognizes the master, that recognition is inferior from the master's point of view because the slave is nobody. To be recognized by a nobody, so to speak, is not to be recognized at all. So even the person who dominates others craves to be recognized, but their unequal relationship prevents them from an authentic kind of recognition. So in a sense, the oppressor is also oppressed by the oppressive relationship. And this, the master-slave relationship is based in another tendency, psychological tendency, that human beings tend to have recognized early on by the Greeks, and that's a desire to actually to be superior to others. And that can be positive. To be recognized in that way can be positive, but it can also be very negative, can be very destructive. So on the positive side of the desire to be superior is, well, we would like to be recognized for our achievements. That's a positive and natural thing. We write a great paper, really, and spend many hours writing that paper. And someone else spends 5 minutes writing their paper. Should they, if both papers are given equal recognition, yeah, you both did a great job. One is mistreated or not given fair recognition for the superior paper. The problem, and we would like to be recognized, and it's natural to be recognized for our achievements. When we win the game, when we win the championship, we want to be recognized as the champion, right? And that's also natural. The downside of this is that we, in our seeking of superiority, there's a tendency to be dominating of others. We can want to lord it over others. We might want to control them. We might want to manipulate them in order to stand above them. And that's very, very destructive and violates their standing as equals, and doesn't recognize them as equals. It violates recognition. Well, we'll talk more about this tendency, psychological tendency for domination, which is a very potent and destructive force in human history. And it can be groups can take on the, as we'll discuss in a few weeks, we are also very tribal. We have a tendency towards tribalism, for in-group bias, out-group hostility. And when that's in combination with the desire to be superior, and that leads to domination of one group over another. So recognition is also an element of fairness, is the idea. Any questions? Does that make sense? Does this so far sound reasonable? Do you? Equality and the mutual recognition of equality. Good. The third element of fairness, a very important element. They're all important, and they all work together. They fit together to create fairness. But the third element is reciprocity. And reciprocity requires, in the end, mutual agreement between us. There are dimensions to reciprocity. One dimension of reciprocity is that we can't, it is wrong, it's unfair to claim something for oneself, in particular a basic moral principle or good, a right, to claim a right for oneself, but to deny the same right to others is a violation of reciprocity. So reciprocity, in one sense, means that whatever we claim as right for ourselves, in a general sense, should be acknowledged as right for others. So we can't claim rights for ourselves and deny them for others. And we have a long history of doing that, of certain groups claiming rights for themselves, but denying the same rights to other people. And that would be a violation. That, whenever that occurs, that's a violation of reciprocity and is unfair, and thereby unjustifiable. Also, the objection, and this is fundamental to reciprocity, the objections of others to a claim of principle, the objection of others must be taken into consideration. And this result, in other words, whatever principle we agree can come to it requires mutual agreement in order to be justifiable. And to be mutually agreeable, we have to allow for the possibility that others may have reason, valid reason to object or to reject the principle. So based upon that notion of reciprocity, we could call it reasonable rejectability, that each person party to the deliberation has equal standing, and having equal standing, they have a right to reject the principle on reasonable grounds. Not just not an arbitrary rejection, but a reasonable rejection. And Rawls gave reciprocity of agreement requires that we arrange our common political life on terms that others cannot reasonably reject. And Thomas Scanlon wrote, thinking about right and wrong is, at the most basic level, thinking about what could be justified to others on grounds that they, if appropriately motivated, could not reasonably reject. So reciprocity requires us to consider the reasons of others and to arrive at a mutual agreement with them. And to really, if someone has a strong, reasonable objection to a principle or a policy, we need to be fair, we need to listen to them and take their point of view into consideration. We do that all the time, right, in our lives. To be fair with our friends, for example. If a friend has a strong objection to something we propose, out of fairness and friendship, we say, okay, well, why do you oppose doing this? Oh, okay, yeah, I get it. Those are good reasons. I'll reconsider my proposal. And that's a form of respect as well. To respect them is to engage in reciprocity with them. So that's reciprocity. Any questions? Does that make sense? So we have equality, recognition, reciprocity, and finally the fourth element is impartiality, to be impartial. And we discussed this briefly on Tuesday, impartiality. The claim or the principle must be impartial in the sense that barefaced appeal to self-interest is not legitimate. It's not justified. That in any kind of deliberation, political, moral deliberation, one should attempt, especially a moral deliberation, one should attempt to bracket one's self-interest as much as possible. To be impartial and not to be biased in favor of oneself. Self-interest, and this gets a little tricky because self-interest is rational. We have rational self-interest, and therefore it is reasonable for us to pursue our self-interest. And we might adopt a principle of indifference by saying, I am not to do anything in order to help others when they are in need or to assist them in distress. At the same time, it is rational for me to do so in view of my own interests. That would be a principle of rational self-interest. I'm only going to help someone, I'm only going to assist someone if it helps me, is in my self-interest. If it's not clearly in my benefit, helping someone, if it's not in my benefit, I have no obligation to do That's a principle of indifference, which perhaps violates impartiality. Is this fair? Is this principle? Would you say that is a fair and a justifiable way, a fair and therefore justifiable way to relate to others? I will only help others if it's in my own interest. Would that work as a parent? Does that work as a spouse, as a married couple?
I suppose it's just kind of based on what situation. Like obviously, as a family member, like a parent or a spouse, not exactly the best thing to do. But
right. You'll get into trouble that way, I guarantee.
Right. But then again, it's also different for work. Like obviously, a lot of people don't always enjoy their jobs, so they go for their own self-interest, get
Right.
paid, for their benefit. So
Right.
it just depends on the situation.
Yeah, and that's totally justifiable to pursue our self-interest. However, impartiality and other criteria of fairness would suggest that our pursuit of our rational self-interest has limits.
Yeah.
And should be constrained by what we owe to others. So the exclusively rational self-interested actor is a bit of an abomination, because they will do whatever is necessary to advance their interests. They will use, exploit, murder anyone who's standing in their way, out of rational self-interest. That's extreme. But a person like that we call them sociopathic. They could be highly rational, could be highly intelligent, but they do not care about anything about others. They do not, and they will trample over others whenever they determine that it's in their interest to do so. I think Vladimir Putin, for example, is an example of such a person. He will murder thousands. And there are other characters, such characters in human history, to get their own way. So that illustrates the necessity of impartiality. We could ask why there's something profoundly missing in the principle of indifference. Impartiality also relates to various judgments that we should work. We should try to be impartial as much as possible in our judgments of others and our judgments about the application of principles as well. And that's illustrated by not being the judge in your own case. To be the judge in your own case or in the family's case, etc., is to violate impartiality. There was a recent example of that. The Supreme Court ruled. I've forgotten the topic. There are so many. It had to do with former President Trump's a claim he was making before the court, and the court ruled on an 8-1 basis to reject his claim. And the sole dissenter was Clarence Thomas by the court, and he voted to uphold Trump's claim. I think it was about the January 6th events. As it turns out, his wife was involved with Trump and the Trump team. Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny Thomas, was involved with the events of January 6th. And apparently she's going to testify to the January 6th Commission next week, I think. What many observers argued was that Justice Thomas should have recused himself. His vote didn't matter because it was a supermajority, 8-1, striking down the claim. But he shouldn't have even been involved, it is argued, because his wife was involved. And so he couldn't exercise, because his wife's involved, we would assume that he couldn't exercise an impartial judgment in the case. He didn't recuse himself, he voted. But many argue that he should have recused himself on the grounds of impartiality. That a judge must be impartial. And when a family member has an interest in a case, you have to recuse yourself. And that's actually the law in lower courts. The ethical code says if you have any interest, perceivable interest in related to a party, to a case, you can't rule in the case. It's like a surgeon. Surgeons don't operate on their family members, right? Because they can't maintain impartiality in those situations. Too emotional, they can't make clear impartial decisions under those conditions. Same with the law. Same with our moral judgments, our moral reasoning requires impartiality. Does that make sense? So we have these criteria of fairness, combined equality, recognition, reciprocity, and impartiality. They comprise the idea of fairness. And the idea is that these components of fairness, and fairness in general, is the basic criteria or criterion upon which we should evaluate our moral principles. Do our moral principles of justice, in our case, do the principles of justice that are going to regulate the basic institutions of society in fundamental ways, are they fair? Are they consistent with the elements of fairness? Do they violate equality? Do they violate recognition? Do they violate reciprocity? Do they violate impartiality? Or are they consistent with them? And as we noted on Tuesday, these elements of fairness are presuppositions, along with others, of moral reasoning. They define what it means to be legitimately moral. So we can draw on and utilize these criteria for thinking about, for reasoning about our principles. And including our rights, what rights we should acknowledge, and what duties we might have corresponding to those rights. We would evaluate in terms of fairness. Does that make sense so far? We're going to be working with this through the remainder of the course. We're going to appeal. We're going to look at many different principles in 5 domains of justice. And we'll apply the idea of fairness to those principles as a way of reasoning about them. This isn't mathematics. It's not an exact formula, but it's a framework for thinking about and making judgments about our principles of justice. And it's open to interpretation, of course. But this is probably the best we could do. Identifying some basic criteria upon which we can reason. Yes? Okay. Yeah. So we are going to reason in terms of fairness. And then, so that's on a basic level. We're going to appeal to fairness to justify or not to critique and reject certain principles. But we're going to appeal to these presuppositions of fairness to justify our choice of principles of justice, and including our rights and our duties. And then on another level, if we have acceptable, justifiable principles, then when we consider more specific laws or practices or policies or political decisions, we can evaluate those decisions and those choices in terms of our principles. Does X policy choice by the president stand up to, is it consistent with our principles, and also is it consistent with fairness? And the idea of moral reasoning extends, especially because of reciprocity and the requirement of mutual agreement. Moral reasoning in this way is public. It involves deliberation with others because it is addressed to others. So in a sense, moral reasoning is a form of public reasoning, public deliberation. And of course, when we're deliberating about justice, peace and justice, it is necessarily public. We have to engage with others in our deliberation. And we'll be doing that amongst ourselves here to practice how that would work, to engage in public deliberation amongst ourselves as preparation for possibly doing it in real life as citizens of the country. So it's important to acknowledge that moral reasoning is also public. It's a form of public reason and a form of public justification as well. So we have these dimensions. This is all about justification, moral reasoning to justify our claims and principles and our judgments about policies, etc. So we're dealing here with moral reasoning. Essentially deals with justification, and there are various dimensions of that enterprise of justification. The first is the justification of our principles of justice at a very basic level. Then there's judgment, which is the application of the principles of justification, principles of justice to the justification and an assessment of specific laws, policies, etc. So judgment involves the using our principles that we have justified in terms of fairness, our fair principles, to make judgments about about more specific decisions, including the more detailed rules that govern our institutions. Justification also involves, therefore, a critical analysis of invalid justifications. So, an important part of moral reasoning is not only to just be able to justify one's claim, but also to critique the claims of others. Because often others will engage in invalid reasoning, and we're awash in all kinds of propaganda and various ideologies that may not survive, should not survive critical scrutiny. So a part of moral reasoning is also engaging in the critical scrutiny of other claims and other justifications, purported justification. That's an important element here as well. So we can have valid, justifiable principles, but they're going to be at times invalid, unjustifiable principles, and unjustifiable reasons that back up those principles. And we also have to be equipped to be able to critique them and to reject them on reasonable grounds. I should note that justification or moral reasoning in general involves what Hannah Arendt called thinking, and that's at a very basic level, is the capacity to say no to something, to injustice, and also to say no to authority, persons of authority that are trying to persuade you to do something unjust. Arendt developed this idea late in her life when she went to Jerusalem and to cover for the New Yorker magazine. She was a Holocaust survivor herself. She fled Nazi Germany in the 30s, ended up in New York City for the rest of her life. So she was a witness to the atrocities of Nazism, and she was commissioned to cover, as a journalist, cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1965. Eichmann was a high-ranking officer in the German SS, and Eichmann's job was deportation. He was assigned to deport Jews and others to the concentration camps. That was his job. He made the trains run on time. So Eichmann was himself responsible for had a hand in the deaths of millions of people. And he fled. He was able to flee Germany at the end of the war, and he settled in hiding in Argentina for 20 years or so after the war. And the Israeli Secret Service one of their primary missions was to track down Nazi war criminals. And they were looking for Eichmann. They found Eichmann in Argentina. The Argentine government, which was at the time a right-wing and a fascist government, rejected the extradition order from Israel to extradite Eichmann to Jerusalem to stand trial. And so they kidnapped Eichmann, and they brought him to Jerusalem, and he stood trial in Jerusalem for his crimes. And Arendt went to cover the trial, and she was expecting, long story short, she was expecting to see a monster, Adolf Eichmann. he's gotta be diabolically evil, right? How could someone do that? How could someone organize the death of millions of people? What kind of person is that? So she expected to see someone diabolically evil or perhaps insane. And Eichmann turned out not to be insane. He was quite psychologically normal, had many psychological evaluations. And Eichmann was not diabolically evil. In fact, he wasn't even anti-Semitic. He said, I have no beef with the Jewish people. His motives were not evil as such. You know, you would expect, yeah, I wanted to kill everyone. No, his claim was, I was doing my job. This was my job. And I was, why did you join the SS? Well, I thought it was a good career opportunity. I wanted to get ahead in society. This seemed like a good idea. And I was motivated by career advancement in the SS. I wanted to rise in the ranks. That was his motive, stated motive. Arendt called this the banality of evil, that the motives, on one level, the motives for his actions were banal. They were superficial. Career advancement. You're gonna kill millions of people for career advancement? Really? But on a deeper level, the banality of evil revealed the Eichmann's almost total inability to think. He, according to Arendt, had very little capacity for self-reflection and to be independently thinking on his own. He was very susceptible to authority and to obeying authority, and that was very common among the Nazis. They were very accommodating to authority, and they learned that in school, etc. Always submit yourself to authority. Eichmann lacked the capacity to say no, to really judge what he was doing. And Arendt called this capacity thinking, the capacity to be self-reflective. And that gives you, if you're independently, if you have a capacity of self-reflection, then you can exercise independent judgment. You can say no, even if everyone's saying around you is saying yes, do this. You can say no, that's not right, because I know that I know that's not to be right, even though you're saying it is right. So that the capacity for an internal dialogue of self-reflection is also a capacity of moral reasoning, is my point here. Yeah.
That makes me think of, and you were talking about the Holocaust. I took like a Holocaust class, and also just with like self-interest. They talked about, it's like called something, but it's like people saw the like Nazis killing these Jews, but they were like, well, I'm not Jewish, so like I'm not gonna like say something because it's not affecting me. It's not in like my self-interest. And then like it keeps going on. They're like, oh, well, I don't live there, so like it doesn't affect me. And it just like keeps going, and people continue to like not say something about it. And it's all these people that like know this is happening, but it's not gonna directly affect them until like it keeps going, and then like they end up just like not saying anything, and like they all are like submitting to this authority, like separating the Jews into like the ghettos and like all of that. They just like don't say anything because they're all just like in their self-interest.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a part of a core element of the banality of evil. It's kind of looking away. Right? Doesn't affect me. This atrocity is going on, but I don't care. It's kind of a bystander problem. Very important. So the moral reasoning is we need to develop a capacity for thinking and for reasoning, and also for empathy, right? To recognize the suffering of others or injustice that's going on, and recognizing perhaps our duty to resist that injustice. Great, thank you. Amal?
Yeah, it was just to add on Emma's point. I mean, the war in Ukraine is exactly the same. It's going on, and we all just hear, watching the news.
Yeah.
Just most of the times, I'm like helpless. You know, I know the United States is supplying weapons, but I don't know how effective that is in solving that problem. And we're all just like helpless. And I think there are some of us who think, oh, if it's in Ukraine, it's not going to affect us. It's really far away. But Russia is such a big power that anything can happen to any country, and their leader is not so great in
Yeah.
helping that.
Yeah. Well, we have a definitive interest in what happens, a big fundamental interest in what happens there. But you and I can support Ukraine indirectly. I wouldn't last long on the battlefield, I'm afraid. They wouldn't want me. Yeah, I'd last about 3 hours, I think. So it'd probably be a waste. But I can support our government in providing with resources to fight the war. And those resources have had an enormous impact. What we and the Europeans and others have delivered to Ukraine is very significant. Of course, we could vote to send in U.S. troops and NATO troops and wipe out the Russian forces within days. We would wipe them out. It would be over in a week. But that would probably lead to potentially a nuclear exchange, and that can't happen. You can't take that chance. Sometimes it's tricky. But to turn away or to refuse support for Ukraine, I think, is a fundamental error of moral reasoning. And many Republican representatives have voted against supplying resources to Ukraine in the U.S. Congress and in the House of Representatives and the Senate. They have voted against supplying